Pro-Syrian regime forces enter Afrin, but the Turkish military fights back. Could Ankara and Damascus be on the verge of war? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the militia that calls itself the Syrian Popular Forces. After days of speculation, they finally made their move on Afrin. A Shia militia reached the Syrian city, waving regime flags and chanting slogans in support of Bashar al-Assad. But they weren't there for long. After Turkish shelling pushed them back, Ankara had previously warned Assad's forces against moving in to support the YPG. But the YPG said they'd struck a deal with the regime for their help in repelling Turkish forces. Yet Turkey's president says in this instance, the militia was just a rogue terror group acting independently. Nevertheless, Turkish leadership has sent out a message. Anyone who tries to help Turkey's enemies in Afrin will face serious consequences. Shoaib Hassan reports.
Arriving to save the YPG and further complicate the conflict, these militias loyal to the Syrian regime defied warnings and stormed into Afrin. They intended to provide backup to the forces fighting Turkey.
We are the Syrian Popular Forces, and we have come here to support our people, the civilians in Afrin. We came to Afrin because we are one. We are one Syrian people.
Turkey immediately responded with artillery shelling and says the pro-regime fighters have now been forced back. It's part of Turkey's Operation Olive Branch, which aims to drive back the YPG terror group from its border with Syria. The offensive began in January with the goal of taking the YPG-controlled Afrin and Tal Rifat regions. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Turkish forces have now cleared 300 square kilometers of Syrian territory. It's a tricky situation for Ankara, with US, Russian and Iran-backed regime forces all based nearby. The concern is that the Turkish army could come head-to-head with Assad's forces for the first time, and that would only escalate the fighting. But Turkey's president said after a discussion with Russian and Iranian leaders that the situation for now is under control.
Dün gerek Sayın Putin'le yaptığımız görüşme, Sayın Rouhani ile yaptığımız görüşmelerde bu konularda da zaten mutabakatımız var. Maalesef bu tür terör örgütlerinin bazen biliyorsunuz kendilerine göre aldıkları kararlarla attıkları yanlış adımlar oluyor. Bunlara tabii fırsat vermemiz mümkün değil. Bunun bedelini de çok ağır öderler.
But there's the risk things could get heated again, as Ankara intends to push on towards Manbij, a YPG stronghold where US forces are also based. Could that bring the deteriorating relationship between the two NATO allies crashing down? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Arezzo in Italy is Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Oklahoma University. In Brussels, we have Yahya Al-Aridi. He's the spokesman for the opposition group, the Syrian Negotiations Commission. And from Paris is Can Katerpoğlu. He's a defense analyst at the Center for Economic and Foreign Policy Research, a think tank focusing on Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Joshua Landis. This Shia militia injecting itself into the conflict in Afrin and then being repelled, what do you make of it? Is it a sign of things to come? Is it dangerous?
It is dangerous. It means that Turkey could potentially be fighting the Syrian army, and that would be backed up by Russia. Clearly, negotiations, which have been going on for over a month, even before the Turkish invasion of Afrin, have been bumpy. For a while, we thought that Syria would go in and Turkey would accept it. But now Turkey is saying, no, the Syrian army is coming in to help the YPG. So much will depend on whether the Syrians can disarm the YPG, which is in Syria's interest, and it could be in Turkey's interest as well, to find a solution that would avoid more bloodshed.
Yahya, has this given us an indication that the YPG and the regime might actually be on the same page and possibly working together, as reports have suggested?
Okay, well, We have to look into the roots of this problem. You know, when the uprising started in Syria in 2011, PYD, which is an affiliate of PKK, took somehow the Kurdish issue in general somehow hostage to its own intentions and to its own plans, and didn't share the Syrian people in their uprising. And there came a point when it turned into some sort of a threat at the Turkish southern borders, and at the same time took those areas and the people there, taking advantage of their plight historically at the hands of the Assad regime, and started to manipulate the situation. And there came a point where the Turks felt that their national security was threatened, and in cooperation with the Free Syrian Army, they wanted to liberate these areas from their domination. And that is what is happening. And now it transpires that they are coordinating with the Syrian regime itself. And when they felt that they are pressured by the Turks and the Free Syrian Army, they contacted the militias of the regime and the Iranian ones, and they wanted to, they asked them to come in, which could create or escalate the tension more and more. And Syria doesn't really need more bloodshed.
John, do you think that Turkey might be at risk of having a smaller fight against one group turning into a much bigger fight against many groups?
Actually, no. At this point, no, because the Syrian regime elite forces have a large concentration right now in eastern Ghouta. Also a small proportion of the Syrian elite units, which are really combat capable, are now in Idlib. So what Damascus can send to Afrin right now is the militia force. I don't think that that would be a big problem for Turkey. As we saw yesterday, the Turkish artillery fire to a great extent managed to deter the incoming militia into Afrin. But I can put one reserve here, which is not the Syrian militia, but the Syrian air defenses. Especially after the capture of the Abu Duhur air base. Right. We know that the Syrian air defenses are now robust and formidable in the area. But Russia is in control of the Syrian airspace. So as long as the Turkish-Russian rapprochement is going well diplomatically, I don't think that that would go beyond the limits of a rhetorical escalation.
Joshua Landis, is that what is happening right now? The Syrian regime sending its elite forces to eastern Ghouta, where, you know, the UN is calling it unbelievable, unimaginable, barbaric, and so on. Hundreds of people are dying. It's a terrible situation there. Is that what's happening? They're sending elite forces there, and they're sending Shia militias for hire to places like Afrin to maybe keep Turkey busy?
Well, it's true that the other regions, the Ghouta around Damascus, as well as Idlib, have been priorities for the Syrian regime. That's absolutely true, and they don't have unlimited sources. But the downside for Turkey is, of course, that these are Syrian fighters. And if you kill Syrians, increasingly, Syria is going to get dragged into this conflict. That is not good for Turkey. Turkey does not want to go to war against the Syrian army because Russia will be forced to take sides. And even though there's an understanding, already we saw Erdogan say that he might talk to Assad in extreme situations. Yeah. This is a change. It's a change that's good for Russia. It's good for Assad. So Russia and Assad are using the Afrin situation to force Erdogan's hand into making some concessions, both to Assad, to Russia, and elsewhere, because Turkey does not want to get bogged down in a fight in Afrin where civilians begin to die, and it looks like the Ghouta. And you just described the Ghouta in horrible terms. It's doing no good for Syria in the international realm. And Turkey is going to take the same kind of beating if this war gets nasty.
Yeah. So John, might Moscow be pulling the strings here where, you know, as was mentioned by Joshua Landis, Ibrahim Kalin came out, he said, yes, Turkey might talk to the regime under extraordinary conditions to solve certain issues. Clearest indication yet that Ankara might actually talk to the regime. Is Russia using this opportunity to get Turkey to talk to Bashar al-Assad?
Of course, since the beginning, it was, I think, the Russian position to renormalize Turkish-Syrian relations, to give more legitimacy to Assad, their client, in international arena, not vis-a-vis Turkey only, but I think in international arena, Russia wants that kind of way forward for Syria. But the important thing here is compartmentalization of Turkey's position. In extreme cases, Turkey can talk, as the government officials underlined, with the Syrian regime or the representatives of the Syrian regime, but that would be strongly framed by either a humanitarian agenda with regards to the civilians in Afrin or a security agenda with regards to the extreme cases that would need urgent intervention. Apart from that, when it comes to political dialogue, when it comes to restoring the diplomatic ties, I don't think that Russia has what it gets to force Turkey's hand to that extent.
Yahya, what do you think was said during those phone calls between the presidents Erdogan, Rouhani, and Putin? We need to make sure we're all on the same page?
Well, they are trying to be reading from the same page, those three, be it Turkey, Iran, and Russia. However, as your guest said, it is difficult to just normalize relations between Turkey and the Syrian regime. It is even immoral, because there were many statements on the part of Turkey describing the atrocities being perpetrated. Russia may have interest in achieving this goal, but actually it cannot. Now, there is this tripartite sort of relationship which could turn into certain points into points of conflict. Now, you know, they are among us themselves trying to be close, each two together at the expense of the other. So this is not a normal relationship between these three. However, the Assad regime is taking advantage of such ill or sick relationship and promoting its existence or trying to remain in power as long as possible. And your guests also mentioned Al-Ghouta. Al-Ghouta mass murder is taking place these days with the Assad militias supported by the Iranian ones and with the Russian support from the skies. Now, this bombardment taking place and the mass murder taking place is unprecedented in the past 2 days. If the term Holocaust is to be used again, I believe it can be used in Al-Ghouta today. Now, other areas in Syria are in turmoil continuously, and the more tension there is, the longer the life of this brutal regime is. So the world should come to a point of understanding that the source of tension, be it the Kurdish issue, the population, the people issue, the Syrian people's issue, the displacement of people, all these things need to be taken into consideration, and that the world has to come to an understanding that this regime is the best prescription for the continuation of tension, and it could turn out into something more horrible. This is our understanding, and all the parties, especially in the international community, the Security Council, should come to an understanding that this whole saga should end.
Joshua Landers, before I let you go, let me ask you about the Iranians. There are those who believe this latest example of that militia marching on Afrin is showing that the Iranians are getting even more muscular when it comes to the Syrian conflict. Is that true?
Well, clearly, Assad's win is a win for Iran and for Russia. The three are partners working together in the same way that the Arab rebels are working with Turkey to attack Afrin. So in that sense, everything that helps Assad helps Iran, which clearly will upset the United States, which is trying to roll back Iran in Syria. These militias are Syrians, of course. They are not Iranians, but Iran supports the Assad government, and that's a very important alliance. There's no doubt about it. So it does help Iran for Assad to remain in power and to impose his sovereignty over additional districts inside Syria. And that's what we're seeing. What we're seeing now is at the end of ISIS, there was a broad agreement to just attack ISIS. Now that ISIS has been destroyed, each country, major country, is trying to grab as much land from the rebels as they can. The United States has taken 30% of Syria in the north. Assad is trying to grab the Ghouta now, Der'a, up near the Golan Heights, and of course Idlib. But Turkey does not want to be left out. And Turkey wants a long band of territory, a contiguous band of territory, to connect together everything west of the Euphrates, Afrin, moving down towards Idlib. And so the potential for conflict with Assad and the Russians is considerable, because the Russians and Syrians are trying to limit the amount of territory that Turkey can take. And Turkey, of course, is trying to sidestep this and continue with pushing around and getting a border zone that would be a large contiguous buffer zone around the edge of Syria. And so this is the end game in a sense. The rebellion is dead, but the major powers, America, Turkey, Russia, and Syria, are all trying to take as much of the remaining rebel land as they possibly can.
Well, there are those who believe it's going to get much uglier before it gets better. That's where we leave you, Joshua Landis. We're going to say goodbye to Joshua Landis and bring in Lawrence Korb now. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and is now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Larry Korb, thanks for joining us on the show. I wonder, does Washington feel maybe that it's backing the wrong horse when it sees a group like the YPG making contact with the regime, making contact with Shia militias, which are controlled by the Iranians? Might Washington be getting itself further entangled in a big mess now?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the United States is unhappy that the people we've supported, the YPG, to help fight ISIS, now are making common cause with the Assad government and indirectly with Russia and Iran. And that's why I think it's very important for the United States and Turkey to get together to figure out, you know, what's going to be the next steps. Unfortunately, the Turks went into areas controlled by the groups we had supported without consulting with the United States and working out some sort of rules of engagement.
Is that fair, John?
Well, I think this issue has two dimensions. The first dimension is about larger international relations context. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey and United States. I personally value Turkish-American relations to a great extent. Turkey and United States worked in Afghanistan together, in Bosnia together, in Kosovo together, 1990s, in Afghanistan in the 2000s, in the NATO operations in Libya, in Lebanon. United States of America is the major primary power within the NATO alliance. United States foreign policy cannot be framed in a very narrow context of Syria that PYD can only offer. Whereas, on the other hand, Turkey can offer a broad array of cooperation, security and defense cooperation options to Washington, ranging from the Balkans to the Central Asia. This is the strategic dimension of the issue. When it comes to the tactical dimension of the issue, we see that there is an organic tie between the PKK terrorist organization, which is also designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, and YPG. It is not only the Turkish sources claiming that, even the academic studies done in the US universities are showing this very fact. I think we need an adjustment both in the strategic and the tactical dimension of the Turkish-American bilateral ties. And I think the Tillerson visit, the recent Tillerson visit, gave us some optimism about that.
Okay, so Larry Korb, is Washington willing to make that adjustment for its NATO ally?
Well, I think it is. And again, we're talking about, Afrin here, which the Turks went in without consulting us. We have not provided as much support as the YPG thinks it deserves, given, how much they have expended in fighting ISIS, which is why they're willing to make arrangements with the Syrian government. And I think if we could work out some, as I say, rules of the game, particularly west of the Euphrates, then I think we could come to, an agreement. But the fact of the matter is, by Turkey going into Afrin, basically without working out the details with us, they put us in an impossible position. And as has been pointed out, the winners here are Assad, Russia, and Iran. They're the ones who are winning there. And so the United States and Turkey, who have been traditional allies, we still have a base at Incirlik, we need to work it out so we can ensure that we have our interests. But right now, with what's happening in Afrin, we're giving the Syrians an excuse, the Syrian government an excuse to come into an area that they weren't controlling before. Let me give Yahya al-Aridi the final word here, because unfortunately we are out of time, but I want to add another 45 seconds or so to this. Yahya, as a member of the Syrian opposition who wants change, who wants Assad to go, who wants to see this war come to an end, how do you feel about the Turkish relationship with the United States? They have this volatile marriage. Does it matter to you as a member of the Syrian opposition whether they are experiencing tension or whether they are at peace with each other?
Well, the 45 seconds have been consumed by your question, but let me just comment on your guest's statements and the whole general issue. Actually, everybody is talking about countries, United States, Russia, Turkey, Iran, the Syrian regime, etc., etc., and nobody is talking about the plight of Syrian people in general who have been victim to all those vicious and bloody and criminal interests of those countries who have interfered. First of all, we had the pretext of terrorism created by the regime and those who supported it, and it was the fight against the people themselves who said no to this regime. And later on, we had all these powers coming into Syria and starting conflicting with each other, and all at the expense of Syrian people, their land, their dignity, their life, etc., etc. Nobody is talking about this, whether I'm in the opposition or in the other side, and just to evaluate the relationship between the United States and Turkey. Now, they are strategically friends. Turkey is part of NATO, and the United States cannot have any shaking of this relationship with Turkey. But at the same time, all the parties, be they Russia, Turkey, United States, should care about Syrian people. This is the most important thing for us. We want them to be happy with each other, but not at our expense. This is the point. And nobody is paying attention to this. The victims in Al-Ghouta today are similar to those who have been victims to the Holocaust. And nobody is using even that word. Nobody is paying attention to those people. Talk, and interests and conflict inside the Syrian arena, and nobody is paying attention to half of the country being displaced, to a million people being killed, to half million being still in the Assad regime's jail. This is the real issue that needs to be talked about, not the interests of countries conflicting with each other in that horrible arena brought by the Assad regime. This is the point.
Sir, passionately put. And you're all always welcome to return to the program. For the moment, I have to move on. Yahya, Jan, Larry, and earlier Joshua, I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still ahead on The Newsmakers, Nigeria releases nearly 500 Boko Haram suspects and sends them to be rehabilitated. But why the need for rehab if they're innocent? And could a new political party block Britain's exit from the European Union? We speak to one of its leaders. Boko Haram is one of the most feared terror groups in the world, and Nigeria just released nearly 500 of its suspected members. It comes after one of the largest mass trials in history, where more than 200 people were found guilty of links to the militant group. But most were set free after courts couldn't find enough evidence to prosecute them. Rights groups have criticized Nigeria for holding many of the detainees for years without charge. And now, even after their release, the government says they must go through a proper rehabilitation process. But if they're innocent, why? In a moment, we'll try to get some answers. But first, here's Christine Pirovalakis.
Nigeria is dealing with a question as old as crime itself: how to strike a delicate balance between punishment and rehabilitation for fighters of the radical armed group Boko Haram. The country just concluded the second phase of one of the largest mass trials in history. It's involved more than 2,300 suspects. 205 people have been found guilty of terrorism, including the mastermind behind the abduction of the 276 Chibok schoolgirls. They will now serve jail terms ranging from 3 to 60 years. Another 526 people allegedly affiliated with the group have been released due to a lack of evidence, but they must now undergo rehabilitation. Some detainees have been held for years without charge and are still waiting for their court dates to be set. The vast majority of these suspects are men, but some include women and children.
The person that believes in nationalism is the one we are at war with. The person who believes in disseminating Western education is the one we fight.
Nigeria is part of a multinational joint task force against Boko Haram. It was set up in 2015 and includes Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. Over the past 9 years, the militants have targeted all of these nations. They have killed more than 20,000 people, displaced 2.2 million, and left another 10 million people in need of food and shelter.
They attacked my home. I was 5 months pregnant with twins. They killed my son.
The group has vowed to fight economic inequality and government corruption and create an Islamic state in the region. But in its pursuit, fighters have burned villages, killed men and boys who refused to join them, and kidnapped and raped women and girls.
We are the Chibok girls. By the grace of Allah, we will not return to you.
Negotiations for the release of about 100 young women kidnapped from a school in Chibok in 2014 are still underway, as another school in northeastern Nigeria narrowly escaped yet another attack. The Nigerian government and military have announced the defeat of Boko Haram several times, even as fighters continue to launch attacks in the country's northeast, and its leader remains at large. Boko Haram suffered heavy losses after West African countries launched a military campaign in 2015. Although the group is far less deadly than in its heyday, Boko Haram remains a force to be reckoned with. Militants have recently changed tactics, deploying young women and children as suicide bombers. As the number of deaths keep rising, the government has vowed to spend $1 billion to fight the group. It's also purchased more than $500 million worth of warplanes and weapons from the U.S. Since the government began its crackdown, hundreds have been arrested and many more sent to be de-radicalized. But as Nigeria's military fights to stamp out the remains of Boko Haram, can its violent ideology be eradicated? Christine Pirovalakis, The Newsmakers.
Let's open up this discussion and go to London, where we're joined by Philip OWar. He's the chairman of the UK chapter of Nigeria's ruling party, the All Progressive Congress. And also in London is political analyst and Nigerian affairs specialist Kayode Ogundamisi. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Philip.
Thank you.
This idea that almost 500 people have been released, is that a good sign?
I think so. I think it's a good sign that things are being done and in the right way as well. These people that have been released are not considered to be high security individuals, and these are people that have been properly assessed, psychoanalyzed, and plans being made for their rehabilitation. So I think that it's a good sign that, unlike in the past, the present government is doing quite a bit, not just in terms of winning the battle on the war front, but also ensuring that the community as well as the population involved in this disaster is being taken care of.
Philip, help me understand. If they've been found innocent, and some of them were held without charge or trial for many, many years, why are they being rehabilitated? For what? From what? To what?
Well, I mean, firstly, we have to understand that these were individuals that were most likely picked up in the line of war. They were not picked up from their homes. They were not picked up from their marketplaces or from their offices. These were people that were considered to be potentially part of the enemy combatants. So, I mean, as it is in a war of this type, of this sort, where sometimes you are not sure of the real enemy because they are not wearing uniforms. Most of them are not wearing military fatigues and all that. It has to be the case that individuals picked up in such vicinity will have to be taken into custody and properly questioned.
Okay.
I think that the issue here is that these individuals were picked up, unlike in the past. They were questioned, assessed, and those of them that are deemed to not be of high security status are released, and something is being done to make sure they help them settle back into normal life.
Okay, and in a moment, I'm going to talk about those who were sentenced, including some of the high-profile people. But Kuroda, do you believe that what Philip is saying is true, that, look, in Nigeria, you are innocent until proven guilty. If you haven't committed a crime, you'll be released. But if you were associated with Boko Haram, you're going to be rehabilitated? That this is a good sign of proper checks and balances in a proper judicial system?
Let us put this into perspective. Some of these people have been held for as long as 5 to 7 years. This government has been in power for about 3 years. How will it take a country like Nigeria almost 3 years to determine if someone is innocent of a crime that has not been charged into a court of legitimate jurisdiction? It's quite unfortunate. It's quite sad. This is going to be a breeding ground for the terrorists that everyone is united in condemning and saying they're a danger to our community. I mean, the government needs to actually do better than this. It should not take almost 3 years of a government in power to set people free when they are found not wanting of any crime and they've not been charged of any crime. I mean, guilt by association is something that should be eradicated from any modern society, not to talk of a democratic society as Nigeria would like to call itself.
Okay, so that's an interesting spin on it. So, Philip, let's look at it from this perspective. The fact that somebody might have been in jail for 5 to 7 years was a sentence in itself, right? And the fact that they need to be rehabilitated now, maybe their entire lives were turned upside down. And there are some extraordinary stories. There were mechanics who happened to service a vehicle belonging to Boko Haram. There was a girl who was 11, married against her will to a Boko Haram fighter. These are innocent people. Would you agree that there was an element of guilt by association here, and these people have paid a price because they were rotting in jail cells for 5 to 7 years?
Well, I think that, as I said earlier, I think that in situations of this sort, it's extraordinary, and we have to accept that it's going to be very difficult in the theater of war of the kind that Nigeria has been battling, and as we see across the world, for you at the point of action to separate these individuals. Now, whilst I agree with Kuroda, for instance, about the length of time that this government has been in power, I think that Kuroda also will have to accept that by the time this government came into office, the level of aggression, the intensity and scope of activity of Boko Haram was such that the first thing that any reasonable government would want to do was to ensure that the enemy combatants were appropriately and well degraded, for some level of normality or peace to return, and then to shift resources to what is going on now.
Okay, good point. So let's ask Kayode. You were asked, would you accept that? Do you accept that?
The fact is that these are not enemy combatants. These are innocent people. By the government's admission, they are innocent people. They've not been guilty of charge to any court. They are not guilty of any crime. Rather than talking about rehabilitation, what the government should be talking about is compensation for the many years of unlawful detention. I mean, these innocent people need to be compensated full time. They need to account for. The government should be apologizing for holding them against their will for as long as 7 years, in some cases, some 3 years, some infants and underage children. So government should be admitting responsibility, and there must be a process in place of speeding up investigation. The military needs to be empowered. The security agencies must have the skills and the manpower to gather intelligence to make sure innocent people are not being held in detentions across the country. One would admit progress has been made in the capacitating Boko Haram's ability to strike in a much more larger scale. But when you hold people against their will just by guilt by association, you create a breeding ground for the terrorists. And when these people go back to their community, they look at those lost number of years in detention, and they get attracted to actually supporting the dissidents. The government would need to hold itself to a higher standard than it held the government in which it replaced.
Okay, so Philip, guilt by association, people held against their will. I know you're saying that this is an incredible context and it's a terrible battlefield, and that's well understood by everybody. Boko Haram are ferocious and terrible, right? But if you were somebody who was caught up in the mix of things, you were innocent, minding your own business, and you were caught up and you spent 5 to 7 years in a Nigerian jail, and then they released you, and then they said, to rub it in, listen, we're going to fix you because you've been brainwashed, or we're going to rehabilitate you rather than compensate you. Isn't that a tremendous insult as a Nigerian citizen who might be completely innocent of any crime?
You see, I think that at least need to Kayode speak. I understand where he's coming from, and I totally agree with a number of the issues that he has raised, and as well some of the points you have made. I think that I mean it is absolutely wrong for any individual to be deprived of their rights. I think that it is wrong, But I think that we also have to accept that Nigeria was in a state of total dysfunctionality. That part of the country especially was in total chaos. We had a situation where the military and the security agencies were completely, underfunded. Monies that were meant for activities in these arms of government were just not released to them. We have to accept that things were not just what they ought to be. I agree that yes, it should be the case that the security agencies, the judiciary, the communities should be empowered, to such a level where, people should not just be arrested willy-nilly. I totally agree. But I also want to repeat and say again that in situations such as these individuals, these communities found themselves, I think that differentiating between the word compensation and rehabilitation, becomes a challenge. Now, this government has put in place what they call rebuild, rehabilitate, and I think the third, the R is to restore. So I think that in terms of part of the rehabilitation process should be to ensure that these individuals are empowered. Yes, that should include some level of compensation. Okay. I agree. I mean, so there is no doubt whatsoever that
you folded in compensation into rehabilitation. I want to pick up the coin and flip it and look at the other side now, Kayode. The fact that 205 people were convicted, sentenced, including the alleged mastermind of the Chibok abduction, Haruna Yahaya. When you look at that, don't you feel proud as a Nigerian that, you know, these guys are facing justice, and that when you look at operationally on the ground, the fact that Boko Haram are still terrible, still doing unspeakable things, but they're not doing it to the extent that they were in previous years, don't you feel somewhat happy, somewhat pleased?
You have to concede to this government that they've done much more better than the last government in terms of degrading Boko Haram's ability to murder massively. But you also have to look at the higher standard that Boko Haram are still killing in their hundreds. Just day before yesterday, there were reports of about 74 girls that are missing till now as a result of Boko Haram attack on the secondary school in Yobe. Bomb blasts are still going on across the northeast region. I mean, billions of dollars, millions of dollars are being donated to Nigeria. The World Bank actually announced that there's a concentration of funds on northeast Nigeria to assist the Nigerian government to build communities and restore confidence on IDPs being able to go back to their communities. But up till now, you see have large, massive IDP camps across the northeastern part of Nigeria. So the government needs to start asking himself, apart from glowing words like 3 hours and so much projections, we need to start seeing results. Yes, Boko Haram is not as deadly as they used to be, but when you see an attack that results in the deaths of 40 Nigerian citizens, 60 Nigerian citizens, right, you cannot call that progress. The government needs to actually create a higher standard.
Right, Philip, was President Buhari a little bit complacent in the past when he declared victory, and then we continue to see attacks such as the one that was mentioned by Kuroda in the town of Dapchi in Yobe State, where these guys came, they shot up the place, they set off explosives, and as he said, dozens of schoolgirls had escaped from that private school. So we see these attacks still happening. We see Boko Haram still operationally capable of doing horrible things. Is the Nigerian government and the Nigerian military being a little bit complacent here by declaring victory and thinking this is all done?
I agree that probably President Buhari was rather in a hurry to have declared victory. But I think that my understanding of all of this is that in the kind of situation that the country was in, he must have come to the conclusion, being an ex-military general himself, that the capability of Boko Haram to carry out their disastrous and wicked acts had been sufficiently broken. You know, up to this time, Boko Haram are still committing their crimes. But I think that Nigeria is also in a very difficult position and difficult place, because you have these fighters not localized to one country. We have a problem that covers almost the entire Lake Chad region into the Sahel, and therefore mobility and international sponsors are able to keep strengthening the arms of even the remnants of the Boko Haram individuals. Plus, we are having other security challenges up in the northeast and spreading across the country.
Right.
So I personally feel that our military personnel are doing a gallant and brilliant job, but I think that they have reached a point when they have become really, really overstretched.
Okay, so let's get a final...
Just last week or so, you had them be deployed.
Okay, so Kuroda, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
They're doing a good job, but they're massively overstretched, and that might be a worry.
Then you ask yourself, what happened to the so-called multinational joint force that the Buhari government promised Nigerians that they were going to cooperate better with Chad, Cameroon, those neighboring countries, and we're going to have foot on the ground that would put Boko Haram on the defensive and take over and try to take control of our borders. If you still have elements coming in through those porous borders, it means the so-called joint cooperation is not working well. Yes, one must admit the gallantry of the Nigerian soldiers. They are thinly stressed. They have to go across the country. They are now in Benue trying to take care of the farmer herdsmen crisis. But you have to ask yourself, sometimes what they say, what the government is saying, and what we're seeing on the ground do not add up. There's a need for a multinational joint force, boots on the ground to take care of Boko Haram so that the Nigerian military can concentrate on other tasks before it. One of the other things that the territories that are liberated, the facts on the ground as these territories and these local areas are not being occupied because IDPs are not confident enough to come back to those territories. You don't have a local police, you don't have local security agencies that are confident that Boko Haram will not come back and attack those local areas. The government needs to actually look at a much more clearer, holistic approach to this crisis. Yes, they are doing well, but that well is not good enough for millions of citizens in that part of the country who expect that they will be safe from attacks from terrorist groups.
Right, and that's strongly put, and I think that'll be a cap to the discussion. Gentlemen, you know, more than 2 million people displaced, 20,000 killed. It's almost hard to believe that Boko Haram have been around since 2009. That's 9 years already. They still haven't been defeated. Remains to be seen if the Nigerian government can actually defeat them. But for the moment, I have to move on. So Philip Idayewar and Kayode Ogundamisi, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. There will be no attempts to remain inside the EU.
It cost David Cameron his job and made Nigel Farage's dreams come true. Some 18 months ago, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and in just over a year, Britain's 40-year relationship with the EU will come to an end. But not if these guys have anything to do with it. They're called Renew, and they're going to do everything they can to stop Brexit. Inspired by Emmanuel Macron's En Marche movement, the group describes themselves as the more military arm of the Remain campaign and hope to contest in the UK's next general election. There they say they'll target pro-Leave MPs in areas that voted strongly to remain part of the EU. But will they really be able to block Brexit? Well, let's ask one of the party's leaders, Sandra Khadouri. She's coming to us from London. Thanks so much for joining us. Sandra, do you really believe you're going to be able to overturn a democratic process where the majority of Britons voted one way? It sounds very anti-democratic, doesn't it?
Well, actually, the tide is turning here. It's not just us, our political party, that is saying we shouldn't really leave the European Union. It's many groups at the moment, many campaigning groups, and even some MPs and prominent people have come forward now to say, you know what, we're not going to get a better deal in the European Union if we leave, so we really must stay for the benefit of the whole country.
So because of buyer's remorse, you want to have possibly another referendum?
Well, actually, Brexit voters and many people are saying they are changing their minds at the moment. Now they know more about the cost of leaving the European Union. The government has failed in its negotiation approach to help to produce anything that's constructive and that's going to be a better alternative to staying in the EU. And people are aware of that. They're learning more every day about the costs to our country, that we'll have to pay 40, 50 billion to leave the EU. Our economic growth is down. We're losing vital cooperation mechanisms. And now people are learning all that. They're saying we didn't know it would be this complicated, and actually it would distract the government from addressing the problems that we really have.
And for those who would say, all you guys want to do is have as many votes as you can until you get the result that you need. That's not democratic, and that's not respecting the will of the people way back when they actually voted to leave. How would you respond?
Well, it is completely democratic for people to change their minds when they get more information. And actually, it was a very narrow vote, we remember, a year and a half ago, where it was only 52% versus 48%. And now, in fact, polls show a swing the other way. So it was never enough of a consensus for us to leave the EU. We should have really had a two-thirds majority in order to carry out such a difficult and time-consuming process that was going to be painful for every sector and every demographic in the country. And I think it is perfectly democratic for people to hear new information and reconsider a very complicated proposition, which is leaving the European Union.
What are your goals for those elections coming up in May?
Well, we actually want to talk to people about renewing the country. We really want to say that let's address our grievances and inequality in Britain at the national level from our domestic position. We shouldn't leave the European Union to do that. We should look at living standards and low wages and housing, affordable housing, and public services that people feel have been crumbling and are not readily available for everyone. And these are the issues we need to look at in Britain and actually make sure that the left behind and the people who feel forgotten are also coming forward, and we can move forward together.
Why can't you do it within the traditional systems of Tory or Labour or Lib Dem? Why do we have to add a new sort of party to the noise, if you like?
Well, we feel, and a lot of people feel, that the political parties are failing us at the moment. And millions of people feel politically homeless here. They no longer believe in the two major parties, Conservative and Labour, because they feel that they haven't shown integrity, and they've also been disconnected somehow with what people want, and they've led us to the path that we're on. So that while there are many fine MPs, many of them have not had the courage to stand up for the national interest. And we actually were not hearing anyone say what we wanted to say. So we've set up a new party so we can re-engage with the population. We're carrying out a tour of the country to talk to all different sectors, different regions, different age groups, and find out what people really want so we can come up with more effective policies to address them and make people's lives better.
Are you worried that you're putting all your eggs in one basket, where if the Brexit process does move forward as it is expected to, then you're done, you've lost your raison d'etre, you were a one-issue party, you're finished, Brexit happened, move on, the party is dead? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, we are a one-issue party, but our issue is to fix Britain. And even if there was a Brexit, we would certainly work towards having the closest possible relationship with the EU, with our partners, and then hopefully bringing the UK back towards the EU in the coming years. And we would actually start to really address people's problems at home and make sure that we really are addressing insecurity and division in the country and this feeling that there's inequality between rich and poor. And we would really have to be addressing that. So we still think, though, there is a big chance to stop this Brexit process, and we are going to try and do it with many other people who feel the same way.
Sandra Khadouri, really good to get some insight into your party, and no doubt we'll be talking again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, former football coach Barry Bennell is sentenced to 31 years in prison for child sexual abuse. We'll ask one of those abused whether he thinks justice has finally been done. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.